We'll start with Mario Corti, who is a distinguished journalist, writer, analyst of Russian politics, society, and culture. He worked in the Italian embassy in Moscow in Soviet times, co-founded a publishing house in Milan, and publicized the work of Soviet human rights activists. He edited several books on Soviet dissent, chaired the organizing committee of the Second International Sakharov Hearings in Rome, and organized exhibits of samizdat document in Turin and Washington, D.C. He later joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Munich, and then became the director of its Russian service, working in this role from 1998 to 2003. He did a lot of work that you can find in his excellent bio on Free Media Online, a very interesting website that he's one of the editors. Mario is author and editor of several books, including in Russian. One of his books is called Salieri and Mozart. And let me finish with one quotation from Mario Corti's that I found particularly close to my heart. It is from his notes for the speech to the Sakharov hearing in Washington. Here is the quote. "I would like to express my hope that the concern for human rights in the so-called socialist bloc not lead to the easing of our own consciences, but would always be accompanied by an identical concern for the implementation of human rights in our own country, in our own home. If this were not so, then our work would be described in many convenient ways, but it could not be described as a true concern for human rights." End of quote.
As some of you may know, I began my career at Radio Liberty in January of 1979 as an editor and research analyst in the samizdat unit. Selected samizdat documents available in the West were meticulously retyped, annotated, cross-references, and whenever possible, name-indexed. These documents were then published both for internal and external use. Most of these writings, signed with the real names of their authors, primarily human rights activists, were broadcast in full and verbatim on the air. This unique approach, amplifying voices from within Soviet society, became Radio Liberty's hallmark. No other Western broadcaster devoted as much airtime, resources, or care to samizdat materials. Launched through the ether, these writings of freedom fighters reached deep into Soviet territory, even remote regions. As a result, many listeners began to perceive Radio Liberty less as a foreign broadcaster and more as a domestic service. There isn't enough time here to recount the history of RFE-RL and its evolution after the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union and the emergence of new independent states. Suffices to say that perhaps the most dangerous moment for the radio's survival came during that period, exactly when then President Jean-Pierre declared, "Our business is to get out of business." Many of us believed that RFE-RL's days were numbered and that only the RFE-RL Research Institute would survive. This institute, formed from a merger of research departments, archives, and the library, had been created in anticipation of the radio's shutting down. This was a miscalculation. Thanks to the advocacy of leaders like Lech Walesa of Poland and Václav Havel of the Czech Republic, who offered RFE-RL the former Czechoslovak National Assembly building in Prague to host RFE-RL's headquarters, broadcasting continued. Earlier, Estonia's then Foreign Minister Lennart Meri had even nominated RFE for the Nobel Peace Prize. Meri, a faithful listener of the Russian service, after becoming Estonia's president, often called my former boss, Yuri Handler, to praise various programs. The radios eventually moved from Munich to Prague, where they had their ups and downs. After the departure of President Kevin Klose, new administrators unfamiliar with RFE's unique nature arrived. They tried to impose standardized models disregarding linguistic and cultural differences. They increased bureaucracy and added unnecessary management layers while cutting on broadcasting staff. They even attempted to close the Russian service newsroom. A point was reached where the vice president assumed the title of editor-in-chief for all broadcasting, despite lacking familiarity with the languages, cultures, and histories of the target countries. A title that should legitimately belong only to each individual director of the respective broadcasting services, as was implicitly understood in the past. Yet, despite these vicissitudes, Radio Liberty's broadcaster upheld their mission with dignity and professionalism. They adapted to the changing society and audience, proving their relevance time and again. As my predecessor, Russian service director Yuri Handler said, countering Jean Pell's view, RFE was America's best insurance policy in case Russian democratic transition failed, which indeed occurred under Putin's restoration. That alone, for Handler, justified the continued existence of Radio Liberty. Today, we face a brutal, unprovoked war of aggression waged by Russia against Ukraine, a sovereign democracy. Independent media within Russia have been shut down and forced into exile. Journalists are being imprisoned, exiled, or killed. The Russian people desperately needs access to unbiased, reliable information, precisely at the moment when the new American administration is dismantling its international broadcasting. Much like its KGB predecessor, the FSB continues to infiltrate Western institutions and information spaces. However, as I once said in an interview, with certain individuals making decisions about US international broadcasting, the FSB could sleep soundly. Let me recall a quote from Andrei Sakharov's letter from the exile that was mentioned by Dmitry before, published by the New York Times on June 8, 1980. Sakharov wrote, "The West and developing countries are filled with citizens who, by reason of their positions, are able to promote Soviet influence and expansionist goals." Today, that quote applies equally, if not more so, to Russian influence. While the US administration pulls funding from trusted global media, such as the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and Radio and TV Marti, Russian propaganda and disinformation spread unchallenged, amplified by paid agents of influence, fellow travelers, and useful idiots, including so-called Ruslan Versteher, those who understand the reasons of Russia. I will not speculate here on whether the president of the USA or anyone in his team is a Kremlin asset. In any case, Sakharov's statement rings incredibly true regarding the current American leadership. The unfortunate reality is that this administration has become a mouthpiece for Russian propaganda and misinformation, evidenced by numerous statements from its members and the president himself. Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert Kennedy Jr. claims that Ukraine's 214 Revolution of Dignity was a coup d'etat financed by the USA. Trump's real estate buddy, Steve Witkoff, and his special envoy to Moscow argues that the occupied territories of Ukraine should belong to Russia because they are Russian-speaking. President Trump's claims that Zelensky, a dictator without elections, started the war. In February, the US objected to calling Russia aggressor in a G7 statement marking the third anniversary of Russia's attack on Ukraine. At the same time, it declined to co-sponsor a UN resolution supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity and condemning Russian aggression. While Russia is on the brink of economic collapse, depends on weapons from China and Iran, and soldiers from prisons and North Korea, the apprentice dictator comes to its rescue. He comes to the rescue of Putin, someone he apparently admires. He flatters and appeases the Russian tyrant, an international outcast and a war criminal, elevating him to the status of a legitimate negotiation partner, siding with him and ready to hand him almost everything he wants, including territories that do not belong to Russia or America, but to a sovereign country. Asked by a journalist what Russia would have to give up as part of a peace agreement with Ukraine, Trump, in his characteristic convoluted manner, responded that Russia would have to give up all of Ukraine, meaning that Russia would be making a concession if it agrees not to take over the whole country. If we consider all of this alongside his statement that Ukraine will never join NATO, it becomes undeniable that Trump has no peace plan whatsoever. He is merely demanding Ukraine's capitulation to a country that has not won the war on the battlefield. The announcement that America might recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea de jure contradicts the principles of the inviolability of frontiers and territorial integrity enshrined in the UN Charter and rooted in the Helsinki Final Act. Implementing this would betray previous US commitments, ultimately leading to the destruction of the global architecture built and sustained for decades with the essential contribution of the USA. Recently, President Trump noted that Moscow is stronger than Kiev. The unfortunate truth is that Moscow has become stronger because it found a new ally in Washington. During the outrageous ambush on Zelensky in the Oval Office, Trump resorted to a card game metaphor. You have no cards, he told him. Sure, after Trump's rise to power, Putin's got a trump in his hand. The longer this individual remains in power, the greater the damage he will inflict. If Russia's territorial grabs are legitimized, others will follow. America's long-standing as a beacon of liberty and the paragon of democracy is being destroyed by a man who is no peacemaker, but a warmonger. As former US Ambassador to Kiev, Bridget Brink, said, peace at any price is not peace at all. It is appeasement. And appeasement does not lead to safety, security, or prosperity. It leads to new war and suffering. Building trust takes years, if not decades. Destroying it takes but a few days. And that's precisely what the current president has done. Returning to where I began, we don't yet know with absolute certainty whether RFE-ARA will survive the year as an American institution. We know the Czech Republic is advocating for European support to keep it running. But God forbid that if RFE-ARA becomes European, it shouldn't be renamed into RFA-ARA, Radio Free America, Radio Liberty, with the addition of an American service staffed by American emigre journalists. The Trumps may come and go, but I hope that America, with its tradition of freedom and democracy, a country based on principles and virtues, now being trampled on by the current administration, will ultimately endure. Thank you for your attention.